Everyone. Hello, everyone. If you welcome to today's shir. We're about to start. I'm happy for people to put on their videos so they can share their faces with us. If you don't want to, that's fine. But I'm about to start the shir. Today's shir is going to focus on the challenges of the Jewish state. And obviously, in the background of today's shir are the special days that we're living through right now. And I don't mean Corona, but I mean the special days of Yimei Medinat Israel, we should call it, between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, these very, very special days here in Israel, which really relive the drama of the 20th century when it comes to building a Jewish state. So having that in mind, I would like to focus today on what happened in the halachic world, what happened in the Torah world when the Jewish homeland was established in 1948. My claim, which I'm going to speak about today, is that it wasn't only the Jewish people that were redeemed, it wasn't only the Jewish nation that was redeemed, but the Torah, the Bet Midrash, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Jewish tradition was also redeemed in 1948. Our Torah and our attitude within the world of Torah has changed, and a whole new world of Torah has developed since 1948. I would like to prove this claim today in a few examples, but I would like to focus mainly on two different types of categories of change, I'll call them, that happened in the Jewish world since 1948 when it comes specifically to the Bet Midrash. The two changes that occurred are a little bit different than each other, and nevertheless, I will use the term change. The first one is not necessarily so different than other cases in Jewish history that events required the Bet Midrash, the Torah world, to have a response to the events that are occurring. I'll explain what I mean. During all Jewish history, whenever something new happened, may it be a historical invention like the telephone or the printing press, or it could be a historical event like the expulsion of Spain or the wars of Napoleon. These events obviously challenged the Torah world with questions, practical questions that came up, and there was a need to respond to these questions. And in certain generations, these questions were really creating difficult challenges because of the new technology that happened, like a printing press or a telephone, or due to very dire circumstances and difficult ones like wars and famine or sicknesses that created new questions that no one ever thought before. In those type of cases, the Jewish world had to respond. The rabbis had to reinvent sometimes new phrases and concepts from the past, using them in the present to try to answer and respond to the challenges that occurred. So in a similar way, the Bet Midrash, so-called the Jewish response of the rabbinic world in 48, had to respond to a whole new world of questions that began in 1948. Questions like religion and state, questions like having an Israeli army, having a Knesset, having a government. These type of questions of running a country, the areas that for 2,000 years the Jewish community only discussed theoretically, never on a practical level. And suddenly the Jewish community in Israel was faced and challenged with all these practical questions that no one ever dealt with before. However, I said there are two changes. That was one change, one department of that required the attention of the rabbinical Jewish world. But there's another area, and this is a bit more of a sophisticated, I would say, area, which is that it's not just that we need to look for new halachot or new topics that weren't discussed for 2,000 years. Here, there's a need to change the mindset. Here, we have to look at the reality that we have in front of us with eyes that were not usually, the way that we looked at things usually in the past is not the way we were looking at them in the current situation. If in the past we were looking at Jewish communities, if in the past the rabbis were concerned with the individual and maybe with a community, suddenly in 1948, the rabbis were looking at a totally new situation, a country, a medina. Here, it's not just to look for new phrases and new halachot. Here, there's a need and a requirement to change the attitude, the understanding of the reality that is in front of me. For 2,000 years, there was no reality of a Jewish state. And therefore, it's not just that we're looking for new cases or new scenarios or halachot, but we actually are requiring ourselves to change our understanding of the reality that's in front of us. In today's shir, I would like to go through both these areas, showing examples of new halachot that required the rabbis' imagination even to make up new halachot, and B, I would like to prove that it wasn't just making up new halachot, but it was also a change in the attitude and the understanding of the reality. So let's begin with questions that challenged the Jewish state, that required the rabbis to make up almost new halachot, that because there were no other similar questions for 2,000 years. One good example is working in a power station, and I'll explain. How do we get our electricity? Now, I'm not an electrician. I don't know exactly how chashmal, electricity is created exactly. I assume that it's not anymore a guy sitting on a bike somewhere and biking and creating energy. I guess it's a bit more sophisticated than that. But in many years ago, there was some guy shoveling coal, I guess, into a big furnace and creating fires, which would create energy, which would create electricity. Is one allowed to work in such a energy place, what we call tachanat chashmal, a electricity source on Shabbat? Is one allowed to break Shabbat to work in such a place? I imagine if I would go around and ask people, the answer would be no. What heter, what permission would there be to desecrate Shabbat in such a way of creating electricity? We know that one is allowed to break Shabbat for the purpose of pikuach nefesh, for saving lives. But if it means sitting in the dark Friday night rather than sitting with electricity, then obviously there's no pikuach nefesh involved, and one should sit in the darkness. So in 1948, when we established the state, this question came up. People were concerned whether or not they are allowed to work in such a place. But the question actually was a bit more difficult than that, because it wasn't necessarily about those specific people that had to work in these power plants, but rather the question was whether or not the Jews living in Israel are allowed to benefit from those Jews who are creating electricity. Meaning, let's say for the matter of discussion right now, that de facto there are people that are working in the power plant and they are creating electricity by breaking Shabbat. Now I'm sitting in my house right now, and I have the air conditioning going on right now, and the air conditioning on Shabbat is getting direct benefit from the fact that there's a guy sitting in Ashkelon somewhere who's pedaling this bike as if, shoveling the coal in the furnace, breaking Shabbat, so I, sitting in my house, can have air conditioning. How is that possible? We know that a Jew is not allowed to benefit from another Jew breaking Shabbat. So this was the more difficult question. How is it possible in Israel to benefit from electricity on Shabbat while knowing for sure that there's another Jew out there breaking Shabbat for my benefit? In Chutz La'aretz, this question was never a problem because the assumption is that there are non-Jews working in the power plants, and therefore no one is benefiting from a Jew desecrating Shabbat. By the way, for your information, this question is such a serious question that till today, there are Jews in Bnei Brak, believe it or not, that on Shabbat do not benefit the electricity company. They have their own generators that produce electricity for them on Shabbat. If you go to certain neighbors today in Israel, more in the Haredi community, you can see that some of the houses there before Shabbat connect themselves to their own personal generator. And the reason is that they will not benefit from another Jew breaking Shabbat. That's what they claim. And they rather sit the last hour or two of Shabbat in the dark because the generators don't work always for more than 24 hours. They'll sit the last hour of Shabbat in darkness because they don't want to benefit from another Jew breaking Shabbat. So these two questions, A, can a Jew work in a power plant? But more important, can a Jew benefit from another Jew working in a power plant? Was a classic question that came up in the 50s in Israel, challenging this new phenomena of a Jewish state. The rabbis permitted benefiting from the electricity. And the question, of course, is why. So here's a great example of a need to find a source in our literature that can deal with such a question and translate a precedent case, a case that happened in the past that we can use for answering this question. And rabbis like Rav Shlomo Goren, Chief Rabbi of Israel, rabbis like Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, two very prominent rabbis of the 20th century who really did a lot of looking into the past and using it for the present questions that we have in front of us. And they came up with the following idea. The Gemara tells us that if someone is sick on Shabbat and they're in a situation of pikuach nefesh, their life is in danger, it's very clear, one of the most fundamental laws of Judaism is that you're allowed to break Shabbat to save a life. That's a simple halacha. Everyone knows that halacha. If someone's life is in danger, you are obligated to break Shabbat. Some people will even would be upset that I use the phrase to break Shabbat, because they would say that in that situation you're not breaking Shabbat. You are doing what God told you to do, which is keeping someone alive. So if someone is sick and requires food on Shabbat, they require a piece of meat, then you're allowed to shecht an animal on Shabbat and cook the meat and serve the patient. However, the question came up already hundreds and hundreds of years ago. What would be the case in which I shecht an animal on Shabbat, I cook the meat, the patient takes one bite of the meat and says, "Wow, that was delicious. You brought me back to life. Thank you very much." And the guy sitting next to him is very hungry and he says, "Wow, that looks like a great steak. Can I have a bite too?" Meaning, are other people allowed to benefit from the steak that I made on Shabbat? The rabbis taught us that one is not allowed. By the way, I see the question that was posed right now, and I'll get exactly that question. I'm going to get to that question in a second. Thank you. The Shulchan Aruch says that other people cannot benefit from the meat on Shabbat. However, the Gemara says, if a person could benefit from the shechted meat without it being cooked, then they would be allowed to benefit from it. What's the difference between the raw meat and the cooked meat? The answer is very simple. Shulchan Aruch, the logic of the Shulchan Aruch is that if I were to allow other people to benefit from the cooked meat, the person who cooked the meat might, in the beginning, when he cooked the meat, have that in mind. He might cook a very big piece of meat from the beginning, knowing very well that the patient will only take one bite, and he'll give the rest of the meat to other people. So therefore, once we argue that he's not allowed to share the meat with other people, in the beginning, he already choose a small piece of meat and only cook that piece of meat. However, there is no way a person can choose a smaller animal, as if to say, or a bigger animal when it comes to shecht the animal. When a person shechts an animal, he shechts an animal. There's only one animal in front of him. So we're not concerned that he might have considerations to shecht a specific type of animal, knowing that others can benefit from the meat. And therefore, others are allowed to benefit from the shechted meat, but others are not allowed to benefit from the cooked meat. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the same logic can be used in the state of Israel when it comes to using electricity. The state of Israel needs electricity. We cannot function as a normal country without electricity. Firstly, all the hospitals, all the army bases, all the police, all the people who at home require electricity for pikuach nefesh purposes allow and permit us to work in these power plants on Shabbat. Pikuach nefesh permits you to work on Shabbat, and therefore one is allowed to work in the power plants. However, the question comes up again, just like in the case of the meat. The patients, they're allowed to benefit from us breaking Shabbat. But what about other people? What about the people that are healthy and are right now in their houses? Can they benefit from this electricity that's being made and created for the people that are in the hospital? Is it like the case of shechting the animal, or is it like cooking the meat? Says Rav Shlomo Zalman that it's just like shechting the animal and not like cooking the meat. Why is that? Because Rav Shlomo Zalman says that it's impossible for the power plant to just create electricity and provide it for the hospitals. Once you make electricity, it must go to the entire country. And why is that? Because you don't know what happens in everyone's houses. My father, alav shalom, for example, up until he died a year ago, was living on life support. And the electricity company doesn't know whose house has people living on these kind of machines. So of course, you're allowed to work in these power plants on Shabbat, providing electricity, because you are providing the whole entire country with electricity, which is needed to save people's lives. But even those houses that do not have such people that require this for pikuach nefesh purposes are still allowed to benefit, because just like the Shulchan Aruch rules that if you shecht an animal for someone who is sick, all other people that are not sick can benefit from the meat. So in the case of electricity, said Rav Shlomo Zalman, everyone can benefit from electricity being made on Shabbat, even if they don't require it directly. I will bring up, by the way, that this heter to benefit from electricity and the heter to work in electricity plants on Shabbat is not necessarily only for hospitals. I am bringing up a question which bothers me personally, because I would imagine that maybe the heter is also because a country cannot afford to live in darkness. A country cannot live in a situation in which there is no electricity in the streets. Can you imagine if on Shabbat, for example, there would be no electricity in the streets? It would be dangerous to walk in the streets. Now, maybe people can survive in their own personal private homes without electricity, but can a country survive without electricity? That's why I think that the heter is not just based upon the fact that hospital needs electricity, but rather the entire country needs electricity. So here's just one example of a question that came up in the 50s that was never discussed before, and not only because of electricity, but rather because up until 1948, there were no Jews creating electricity for other Jews. And suddenly we have this new question that comes up, and there was a need for rabbis to look and dig in our sources for precedents that can be used to answer these questions. And here's just one example where great rabbis of the 20th century used these precedents and to allow and permit using electricity on Shabbat. So that's just one example. I want to go to another example, which is a bit closer to home and really applicable, I would say, to these special days that we're living in right now. Yom HaAtzmaut, in 1948, on Hey B'Iyar, Ben-Gurion declared the independence. From then on, Jews around the world have declared that day a day of celebration, a day of reciting the Hallel, a day of coming together with meals and festivals. However, many, many years ago, the question came up whether or not Yom HaAtzmaut should actually be kept, the original date of Hey B'Iyar should be kept always. And why is that? People argued that the state of Israel, being an irreligious state, celebrates Yom HaAtzmaut, and if Yom HaAtzmaut, let's say, would fall on a Friday, that would mean that many, many Jews in this country would be desecrating Shabbat as a result of Yom HaAtzmaut. If Yom HaAtzmaut falls on a Sunday, for example, that would mean that already on Shabbat afternoon, the state would start getting organized and getting ready for Yom HaAtzmaut. And then the government decided that we should change the dates of Yom HaAtzmaut every year based upon whether or not it falls on a Shabbat or not. This led to a very interesting discussion in the halachic world. Is it permitted to change the date? Is Hey B'Iyar actually the date? And therefore, if the government decides to change for whatever reasons it wants to, that Yom HaAtzmaut will not be celebrated on the original date, but rather on another date, should we also change the date? It's a fascinating question. I'll give you an example. Let's say Yom HaAtzmaut falls on a Sunday, Hey B'Iyar, and the government of Israel decides, for its reasons, to postpone it to Monday. Some of the great Zionist rabbis had a big question now. They said, wait a second, the government of Israel has its reasons, but we actually believe that Hey B'Iyar is an important day. Something happened that day. So we want to celebrate Sunday. Should we therefore in that situation now celebrate Hallel and Yom HaAtzmaut on the Sunday? And we could say to ourselves, who cares what the Israeli government said? That's not a reason to change the Chag. I mean, just for the sake of discussion, can you imagine if the state of Israel, for example, would decide to change Purim, to change the date of Purim, to change the date of Pesach, to change Hanukkah? Let's say the government of Israel would say, Hanukkah, Purim, it's not comfortable for us for a certain reason. We want to change the Yom Tov. Would any religious Jew listen to such a decision? Of course not. So here, a very interesting question came up. Should we change the original date of Yom HaAtzmaut and together with the government celebrating on a different day, or we should keep the day Hey B'Iyar? By the way, for your information, in most cases, Yom HaAtzmaut will not be celebrated on Hey B'Iyar. As it happens to be, this year is one of the exceptional years that we are going to celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut on the 5th of Iyar. But in most years, because of the way that Yom HaAtzmaut falls on a Shabbat and a Friday, so most years the government of Israel postpones or even actually makes it earlier. The date will change. So this is a great question. Should we listen to the government in this case and change the date? I find it fascinating that Rav Goren, again, I mentioned Rav Goren, the chief rabbi of Israel, who was a prominent Talmid Chacham and a great Zionist, he actually argued that the Hallel in that case should be said on the 5th of Iyar. Even if the country would celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, let's say in the case that I mentioned before, on the Monday, he argued that Hallel should be recited on the Sunday. However, Rav Yaakov Ariel, the chief rabbi of Ramat Gan, argued against, and I think that is the common custom till today of almost everyone, if not everyone, that we keep the decision of the government and celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut on whatever day the Israeli government decides. And why is that? First of all, Rav Ariel says we have other presidents in the Jewish calendar. We have other cases that Chagim were changed, postponed, due to difficulties that occurred to celebrate on the original day. One of the best examples is Tisha B'Av. In the past few years, we all know that Tisha B'Av is pushed off from Shabbat to Sunday. If I'm not mistaken, the past 2 years, we've been commemorating Tisha B'Av on a Sunday because it was on a Shabbat. Would anyone say, "Oh no, I keep Tisha B'Av on Shabbat because the day itself is important"? No, we changed the date. What about Purim? Megillah Nikret B'Yud Aleph, Yud Bet, Yud Gimel, Yud Daled. The Mishnah Masechet Megillah tells us that Megillah could change to different days based upon the markets. Meaning there are other considerations to take into account. And in Jewish history, we know that dates were changed. Furthermore, when we had a Beit Din and the times of the Sanhedrin, Yamim Tovim, Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuot, their dates were sometimes changed because of considerations which were not necessarily such religious ones. By the way, I don't know if people were aware that there was actually someone that petitioned the High Court of Israel right before Pesach, arguing that due to coronavirus, the Israeli government should decide to change to Pesach by adding another Chodesh Adar. There was actually a person who wrote up a whole paper about this, arguing that in olden days, that's what they would have done in this case. They would have added a Chodesh Adar Bet and postponed Pesach by another month due to Corona. Now, obviously, we don't have the power to do that today because we don't have a Beit Din, but the original idea is very true. We have a system and we have a past in Jewish history in which, due to certain considerations, we are able to change the dates of Chagim. So first of all, says Rav Ariel, we have precedents in the past of moving Jewish holidays, and here again, it would be a correct thing to do if needed. But more than that, furthermore, he argues, there's another reason why we are allowed to change the date of Yom Ha'atzmaut. I think this is a very, very beautiful insight to the whole history of Yom Ha'atzmaut. The real reason, or I would say even the only reason why the state of Israel wishes to change the dates of Yom Ha'atzmaut has to do with it colliding with Shabbat. Meaning, the only reason why the Israeli government would even think of changing Hey B'Iyar to a different date is whether or not Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day, or Yom Ha'atzmaut collide with Shabbat, and which would create a desecration of Shabbat. Now, for all those people who love to complain about the state of Israel, that's not religious enough for them, isn't that an amazing idea? Isn't that beautiful that the state of Israel, the government of Israel, is interested in ensuring that Shabbat will not be desecrated because of the festivals of Yom Ha'atzmaut? And furthermore, this goes back to the beginning of the state of Israel. If you recall, the British were supposed to leave the land of Israel on Shabbat, which the Hebrew date was Vav Iyar. And Ben Gurion was supposed to declare the independence on Vav Iyar. However, he moved the declaration to Friday, Hey B'Iyar. He even made it earlier in the day and finished early enough for those who wanted to get back for Shabbat in order not to break Shabbat with a declaration of independence. Ben Gurion was not known to be the most religious Jew. However, it is astonishing that Ben Gurion realized at the time that it would be impossible for him to declare a Jewish state if that would mean desecrating the Shabbat. So in the very beginning of the state of Israel, one of the main concerns of when and how to declare the state took into account Shabbat Kodesh. Isn't that a most beautiful idea to prove to us that the roots of this state of Israel are connected to tradition, are connected to Torah and mitzvot, and are connected to Kadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore, says Rav Ariel, in every year in which the possibility of Shabbat colliding with Yom Ha'atzmaut and thus creating a Chilul Shabbat is already built in the system. It's built in the original structure of commemorating Yom Ha'atzmaut, that it can never break, it can never collide with the Shabbat, and therefore we are not just allowed to change the date, we are obligated to change the date in order for us not to break the Shabbat, as Ben Gurion himself decided in 1948 to make sure that doesn't happen. So here's another example of a halachic challenge, halachic question, which we looked for precedents in the past to help us decide a halachic question, but also using the unique history of Yom Ha'atzmaut as a reason to allow us to answer the question. As I said in the beginning of today's shir, the challenge of the rabbis during the years of the establishment of the state of Israel was not just to look for precedents that would help us solve the new challenges, but rather they were required to change their attitude, their understanding. Someone pointed out in the chat, I can't really read all the chats that are going through because it's a bit hard to focus, but I saw someone mention Yeshayahu Leibovich, and that is 100% correct that Yeshayahu Leibovich in the 60s, I think it was the 60s, wrote a very important paper on this topic. And it was only many, many years later that certain Orthodox rabbis really, I would say, made similar arguments to what Yeshayahu Leibovich in the beginning of the state was arguing, which is that we're not just looking for precedents, but rather there is a requirement, there's a need to change our understanding when it comes to having a state rather than having a community in front of us. I'd like to give one or two examples for this change, how rabbis were required to change their attitude and understanding of the reality in front of them. And I would say that one of the best cases is the question regarding creating a skin bank. After the Yom Kippur War, there was a talk and discussion in Israel to create a bank, so-called a bank of skin, because as you know, in the Yom Kippur War, a lot of guys got burned in the tanks, and there was a big problem of using skin grafts for those soldiers, and there was a need to create a skin graft. Obviously, creating such a bank possesses a halachic challenge. We are very, very, very careful as Jews to bury bodies right away, and as I'm sure people are aware, we are very hesitant to perform autopsies due to our sensitivity to preserve bodies and to bury them immediately, and not to use any part of a body for anything like a medical experiment, for example, because of the Isur of Nivul Hamet, the Isur to use or benefit from a Jewish body. This question came up in the 70s, but similar questions came up earlier. For example, questions like using bodies for medical students. I see that Dr. Barry is with us today, and I'm sure he knows a lot more about this than I do. But we all know that it's a very important requirement for doctors to study medicine is to use bodies. Doctors learning medical schools in Chutz La'aretz were never trouble with these questions, but in Israel the question came up: what should the medical schools do in Israel? Should medical schools in Israel import bodies from abroad, or are we allowed to use Jewish bodies for medical purposes? this was a very sensitive question that came up. And Rav Goren again addressed this question, and I would like to point your attention to a source sheet I have here in front of me that that deals with this question. If you look in front of you on the source sheet at source number 4, you will see that Rav Goren, Shlomo Goren, discussed this question. And he also used a precedent that occurred in the 18th century, both in Prague and in Hungary at the time, a question regarding doing autopsies for the purpose of curing other people. The question that came up in those centuries before the great rabbis like the Chatam Sofer and the Noda Yehuda were questions whether or not it's permitted to do an autopsy in order to save someone's life. What was the question? The question is very simple. There was some kind of sickness going around, and someone died from this sickness. And the doctors wanted to do an autopsy. They wanted to check out, maybe by doing an autopsy, they can help the next patient coming in. So the Chatam Sofer and the Noda Yehuda, who lived, by the way, different places, different times, both answered that it is only permitted in a circumstance in which the patient is in front of us. Meaning, they argued that if there is someone in the hospital room that the doctors feel and the doctors believe that by creating an autopsy on the dead patient, they will have an answer in which they will be able to immediately save the life of the person in front of them, then it is permitted based upon the rule of pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh, as we mentioned before, the law of preserving a life is one of the most important fundamental principles in Judaism, and one is allowed to do a lot in order to preserve a life, and that would include performing an autopsy, which is maybe an isur, a transgression, but for preserving a life, it's permitted. However, they argue, if the doctors think to themselves that by performing the autopsy, they could save a life in the future, meaning they say, listen, right now, no one's sick in the community, but this autopsy might save a life in the future. We might learn something from this for the future. Both the Noda Yehuda and the Chatam Sofer argued that it is not permissible. They based themselves upon the rule that the Pikuach Nefesh rule is only permitted when the danger is immediate in front of us right now. But any hypothetical, theoretical Pikuach Nefesh that might occur in the future is not enough of a reason for us to currently transgress and do an isur. This was the common psak for hundreds of years regarding autopsies. However, when Rav Goren addressed this question, he changed the whole entire halachic attitude, arguing the following. And I'm reading together with you. You can follow with me as I'm reading. The position of Noda Yehuda and Chatam Sofer, says Rav Goren, is correct and applicable from a halachic perspective, but only when we are talking about Jewish doctors in the diaspora who bear, I'm sorry, again, Dr. Barry, I know we can discuss this and argue about this later, who bear no responsibility for the health of the people in the country. They are only bound by the mitzvah and duty to treat patients who turn to them, but are not responsible for planning short-term or long-term medical services. If you skip a few lines, however, when we are dealing with an independent Jewish state where the government of Israel is responsible to design a medical system in the country for all its citizens, this national responsibility does not express itself in the daily individual planning of medical service in Israel, but rather an overall long-term responsibility. Surely, it is clear that every year a significant number of patients requiring a transplant will be admitted to the country's hospitals. If we do not, worried from the outset about organ donations, we will not able to satisfy the many requests that will arise. So Rav Goren is arguing that the past halachic ruling of the greatest rabbis of past centuries is not applicable to our generation. It is not applicable to a state. We cannot anymore just look at the individual or even at the small community. We in Israel have a responsibility for an entire country. Even if tomorrow morning we are not aware of anyone sick, but we have to plan for those who will come next week, because for sure by next week, for sure by next month, people will be sick. When it comes to having a bank, creating a organ, a bank of skin grafts, said Rav Goren, it could be that right now there are no people in Israel that require skin grafts, but it is the country's responsibility to ensure that in the future, if such a case happens, we will be ready. That allows us, therefore, even now, without anyone sick in front of us, without even any war in front of us, it allows us to gather those skin grafts. It allows us maybe to study medicine using human Jewish organs, Jewish bodies, in order for us to learn medicine, because it's not maybe it'll happen. It is a certain fact that we will require this knowledge to cure and help people in the near future. And the Jewish doctors and the Jewish government's responsibility to ensure the safety of its citizens, and we must plan now, even if the danger is not in front of us. So here is a fascinating example in which it's not just that we have to invent as if new rules from the past that we were not aware of till today, but it's more than that. It's that the understanding is we cannot treat the Jewish state as we would have treated it in the past. I mentioned before that when it came to the question of electricity, some rabbis till today argue that each community should ensure that there are generators for their own private homes and for their own communities. I find that impossible. I find that incredible. I find that that's not a responsible psak for running a Jewish state. We are not living anymore in a shtetl where everyone is responsible for their own home or maybe for their shul community. We are talking now about responsibility for a state, for a government, and that includes Jews and non-Jews, and that includes armies, includes the police, and includes hospitals and old age homes, and therefore the responsibility requires us to change our understanding of how the halacha addressed such questions in the past, and we must change our attitude. So that's one very good example. I will just end by not going to the depth of the other examples, but I will just mention a few other examples. I'm sure people remember that not long ago we had serious arguments in this country regarding swapping, exchanging terrorists for Israeli soldiers. Not long ago, a few years ago, the last story was, of course, Gilad Shalit, the young Israeli soldier who was kidnapped, and we paid a very big price to get him back by exchanging him with live terrorists. I'm not going to go into the whole question whether or not that is correct and whether or not there's a price, but I will mention that this is not a new question in Jewish history. There have been many cases, l'tzarenu, in the past that there were situations in which we had to swap or redeem prisoners. If we go back to the days of the 12th century, the famous story of the Ma'ami Rothenberg, who was kidnapped and held ransom, and there were discussions about redeeming him. There were many, many stories in Jewish history that Jews paid a high price to redeem Jewish prisoners back. And the Gemara itself discusses this. The Gemara in Gittin discusses what is the correct price, what is the ratio of a prisoner that one should expect to pay when one redeems one, a Jewish prisoner. How much money should you pay for that prisoner? And this question was discussed for hundreds of years in the Petei Midrash and the Poskim, because, as I mentioned before, this was a question that resurfaced again and again throughout Jewish history. When these questions came up in the 60s and the 70s in Israel regarding Israeli soldiers that were held captive, and many rabbis said, okay, let's study our sources. Let's study the sources of the Gemara and Gittin and the other Rishonim that already dealt with these questions years ago, and question whether or not we can use them as precedents for these current challenges. Many rabbis, however, argued, and I will mention Rabbi Israel Rosen, who just died a year and a half ago. He was head of Machon Somet, the famous institute for combining Torah and technology, who wrote at the time of Gilad Shalit, wrote an article, a Torah article, in which he argued that all the Gemarot and Rishonim that referred to Jews being kidnapped and held for ransom are not applicable, should not be used in the current discussion regarding Israeli soldiers. They're not relevant anymore, he said, for many reasons. One reason is that we are not anymore talking about an individual Jew who's being held ransom, and the community's responsibility is now to redeem him. We are now talking about an entire Jewish state which is being held captive. And one cannot compare the level of responsibility that the Jews had in the past as individuals and communities to the responsibility of an entire Jewish state. The ramifications of such deals are not similar in any way to the ramifications of the past of Jewish communities needing to redeem Jewish soldiers. Furthermore, argued Poskim, we are not talking anymore about individuals who are held ransom by the non-Jewish communities surrounding us. Rather, we are talking about Israeli soldiers who we send to battle, who we as if chose to represent us, and therefore the responsibility on the Jewish state to bring them back is a very different responsibility than it would have been in the past in Jewish communities. So here's another example of a challenge that one might think that is a challenge from the past that is not new, and nevertheless, our argument is that once we have the Jewish state, even if there are similarities to the past, the whole attitude must change, requires our change due to the fact that we have a Jewish state, and having a Jewish state changes our entire understanding of the reality in front of us. And therefore, I go back to the beginning of today's shir. Yom HaAtzmaut, the day that we say Hallel, the day that we celebrate the state of Israel, is not just a day of celebrating the redemption of the Jewish people and the fact that we are saved and that we can be responsible for our own destiny and how we have our own independence and our own army and we can protect ourselves. But there's also a certain element, I believe, of celebrating the fact that our Torah has been redeemed, that we are able to use our Torah in a way that's applicable to our lives, in a way that prior to 48 was not possible. New rules, new ideas, new sections of Torah are being developed as we speak as a result of having a Jewish state. And that to me is also some part of the celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut next week. Thank you very much. I hope to continue next week with another similar kind of a shir, talking more about the challenges of the IDF, perhaps, than just the state of Israel, or we may go into more specific cases in which we will discuss challenges of having a Jewish state in our generation. Thank you very much.
Rabbi Tabory, thank you. I just got here late because I was teaching at a chat this morning, as you know, but I want to thank you. I heard the last 5 minutes. There are a couple questions on the chat box if you want to take, or if Dr. Pecos would like to ask, because I walked in when you said the notion about, the difference between a doctor in Israel and a responsibility in Chutz La'aretz, and I would agree that can be a troubling position of Rav Goren. I don't know if you want to address that issue and take a look at the chat box, because people would argue today doctors have a responsibility in Chutz La'aretz for the society also. But then you can take the chat box. I just want to mention everybody, 8:30 this evening, Rabbi Ed Shalom will be giving a Parsha Shir, 8:30, same login. And tomorrow morning, I'll be giving a Pirkei Avot at 9:30. Friday morning, we do 9:30 in the morning. But Rabbi Tabory, Vakasha, and thank you.
I would like to address that just in a short response. That better than talking about doctors, I think it's probably better to talk about the health system. Meaning, the argument would be more about the health system in Israel rather than the private doctor. The private doctor again. Who, especially in the 19th century, is seeing one patient in front of him, is not necessarily thinking about next week, next month. They're not necessarily building a program of health for the entire community. Unlike a private doctor, any type of health board, or in this case, a government, is responsible for the entire community. And more than that, they are responsible for what will happen next week and next month. They must plan for what might happen. Take a coronavirus, right? Health systems should be worried about what might happen next year. In 2-3 years, they should have shots for measles and who knows what else in their stores, predicting what might happen in the future. That's the responsibility of a government rather than to a private doctor. I think that's what Rav Goren really was talking about. Meaning his argument was that when the Noda B'Yehuda and Chatam Sofer were giving the psak, they were referring to private doctors in the 19th century that didn't have that kind of approach that we have today in government and health systems. It could very well be that Rav Goren would agree that in Chutz La'aretz, people like Dr. Barry, who has responsibility for systems, would obviously also need to change the attitude than Noda B'Yehuda. I think that would also require a discussion of itself. I think the main difference of what Rav Goren is arguing is changing the perspective from an individual doctor to a government. That's really what the psak of Rav Goren was, and that's why he argued that the attitude must change. There's more to talk about this, but it's a good point.
All right, if you want to take a quick look at the chat box at some of the questions I see people asked during the class. There.
Okay. Wow. Let me see. I agree, by the way, that generators are very dangerous, and besides everything else, they do create hazards and fire hazards, and one should not. That's another problem that I agree. Someone mentioned 100%. Someone mentioned Yishai Leibovich. I didn't read the whole mark, but I did address that Yishai Leibovich was probably very correct in his early understanding of the reality of having a Jewish state. The heat. I would say that the case of heat. Someone asked about if someone is ill in the house and you put on the heat for that person, then other people would be allowed to use the heat, and that to me would also be perhaps more similar to the case of shechita rather than the cooking of the meat, because it's very, very difficult to separate between heating up one house rather than the room of the person who's sick. It could be that would depend upon the situation in front of us. Yes, okay, I'm sorry I can't really refer to all the other chats. I'm happy, by the way, if anybody wants to privately contact me and discuss it further, I'm happy to be in touch with people privately and continue the discussion.